Caring for Kids God's Way, a biblical counseling certificate program in child advocacy developed by the American Association of Christian Counselors through Light University. Your ministry is to be a Galatians 6:2 helper. Ours is to equip you with the highest level of advanced training from the world's leading Christian counselors. 24 experts teaming up to create the most comprehensive child studies curriculum for the personal classroom. May the Lord bless your study as you begin caring for kids God's way. Co-authors of the books Loving Your Kids Too Much and Why You Do the Things You Do, and Liberty University doctoral program professors. Caring for Kids God's Way presents AACC President Dr. Tim Clinton with psychologist Dr. Gary Sipsey. Effective discipline strategies.
Welcome into Effective Discipline Strategies for Kids. I'm Tim Clinton, and this is Gary Sipsey. We're your professors, your lecturers for this particular course, and delighted to do so. Can't think of a topic more important in dealing with our kids and helping parents than the issue of discipline. Nobody, Gary, likes to be the heavy, having to discipline all the time. Maybe some parents get off on it, but I think most parents really wrestle with it. And the truth is, whether it's been in counseling or growing up as kids ourselves or trying to deal with our own children, we've seen the good and bad of all this. You've got two extremes. One extreme is you have overly authoritarian, strict, crazy parents who literally going to beat their kids into submission and subjection, to the other side where you've got parents who just let their kids be unruly, they don't have any boundaries, no structure in their life, and the kids are running all over, creating mayhem out there. Finding balance is a tough thing.
Well, it really is, and that's one of the things that we want to address here is some ways as a parent we can help you find balance. And one of the things we want you to keep in mind as we're talking here is a lot of parents who even go to any of those extremes, especially parents who find themselves in the extreme authoritarian role.
Yes.
A lot of times they find that it's the very behaviors that their kids bring to the table, their kids' temperament, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that sometimes bring out the more extremeness in a person's parenting style. So sometimes it can be very helpful for you as a parent to realize that your child's own personality, your child's temperament can in fact influence how extreme you might be in your parenting style.
Yeah. We want to say also, we're not into parent bashing, but we do believe in the power and influence of a parent. You have a tremendous opportunity, you have a tremendous responsibility, and the truth is there should be some strong accountability going into the premium that God places on your influence in a child's life. And the issue of discipline is about love. It really is. Bringing balance to it again is the heart of the matter, and we'll address that. Now, just some opening thoughts or comments. We know the scripture says, Gary, that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Kids are very impressionable. They love to push all of our buttons. They love to test everything, get into everything, and that's a normal part of childhood. It can be irritating, though, to a stressed out, pressured parent.
Yeah, it can, and that's sometimes the balance that we're trying to bring for parents is looking at what kind of things press their buttons about their kids. Some kids are very curious, very active. They don't have long attention spans, maybe as you do as a parent, where they can sort of sit down and do things the way that you'd like them to do. And so it can be very frustrating to parents if their kid's style doesn't sort of match up to theirs. But then also the other thing that we're talking about is parent stress.
Yes.
And we live in a world now where parents have competing roles. You're a parent. A lot of parents are working, so we got working families where husband and wife are both at it. Yes. 8 hours a day. We've got church responsibilities. We've got baseball. We got soccer. We got, before long, you're sort of always on the go, and it can make parenting a really tough task.
So we're not into parent bashing, but facilitating. The other issue is, I want people to know up front that we really are strong child advocates. Kids are so impressionable and so vulnerable. Every child, like Franz Stott once said, deserves at least one person in his or her life, Gary, who's crazy about them. And so as we go through this challenging area of discipline, taking those just simple thoughts up front to heart and saying they do have everything to do with what we're going to talk about here. All right. Let me give you some scripture verses. Let's just talk through some of these, Gary, real quick, that I think are appropriate. A lot of people refer to scripture and, by the way, validate how they discipline, etc. But I want to comment on some of them, which will help guide us as we move along. Listen to these verses. Proverbs 13:24. Follow along in your notes there. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Proverbs 19:18. Discipline your son, for in that there is hope. Look at Proverbs 23, verses 13 and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he will not die. Punish him with the rod and save his soul from death. Proverbs 29:15. The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother. And then the last verse, Proverbs 29 and verse 17. Discipline your son, he will give you peace. He will bring delight to your soul. Now, Gary, some people take the verses there and talk about the rod of correction and think that discipline is simply about spanking. Child gets out of line, we're going to spank.
Right.
And I've seen many homes where that's all they do. I mean, they're constantly spanking their kids over nothing.
It's very easy for parents to get locked into that mode. And you know, what Scripture does in this part is it's really highlighting the importance of parents disciplining their children. But it seems that the Scripture's very concerned about our kids growing up to be able to live with other people, live within limits, and ultimately get on a pathway that leads them to the Lord, and so that becoming really a believer becomes sort of a step that the child can make rather easily and naturally. The question is, are the discipline techniques that you're using moving your child closer to that or further from it?
Yes.
And what works for one kid may not work so well for another. And so to get locked on the rod of discipline as meaning simply physical punishment, I think is probably a little misguided. There are kids for whom that can work very well for. And most of you that advocate, or most folks who do advocate it, remember that all their dad or mom had to do was just give them that look.
Oh, man.
Now, if you're the type of
terrified.
if you were the type of kid that a look would do it because you were scared that, you know, I've had this once or twice, then that was probably a good enough approach for you. But some of you probably know kids or have kids that a look or even a big stick might not even influence them in that regard. And those kids don't seem to benefit from that kind of approach because it tends to just make them angrier, and they get further and further off the path that you actually want them on.
So Gary, just a quick review of it. Discipline then, obviously in Scripture, is important.
Yes.
And appropriate. Kids, we know this, do better with a frame of reference, a structure to regulate their world around, to understand there are boundaries and there are consequences for the violation of those boundaries.
Absolutely.
It actually almost produces a gentleness about kids. Mm-hmm. You know that? A tenderness when it's applied appropriately. By the way, we're not anti-spanking. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. We think there is a place for it. But if your home is all about discipline, or if you're working with parents and all you see in the home is just discipline upon discipline, it literally can damage damage the soul of a child, to me. And the truth is, here's a key statement. You've heard us say this before. The effectiveness of your discipline strategy is determined by the quality of relationship you have with your child.
Right.
What's the old statement that everyone likes to quote?
The 3
Rules
R's.
without relationship fuels rebellion in a child's heart.
Mm-hmm.
Rules with relationship fuels
Respect.
respect.
Yeah.
All right. Moving then along in your notes, let's move to the next point, and it's why kids do the things they do. Now, you're probably thinking, man, we want to talk about timeout and all this stuff. We really think the context for appropriate discipline is what it's all about. When you understand this, it makes discipline work well. Why kids do the things they do. Gary, really, there's 2 things I want to talk about here, and we've bantered them so many times. Childhood irresponsibility. Remember James Dobson coming out with Dare to Discipline, and Dr. Dobson's really the guy who helped lead a lot of this. And the idea of willful defiance, those two areas for a moment. Let's talk about childhood irresponsibility, because if a child is forgetting his bike out in the rain, and he's an 8-year-old boy and he just forgot, is that an act of willful defiance that needs discipline or correction applied to it? You hear what I'm saying?
Right, and there actually can be correction, which is when I tell you to do something and you forget to do it, how are we going to solve that? What are we going to do about it?
Right.
Because you seem to forget what I'm asking you to do. And that way, you're going to collaborate on it. I need you to go pick your bike up out of the yard, and no, I'm not doing it.
That's different.
That's the willful defiance or willful noncompliance. And they're both handled very differently. So what kind of discipline strategies you would use for the first is very different from what you might use from the second.
And I would almost argue, Gary, that a child who forgets because, Dad wanted me to go rake the leaves, and I went and raked the leaves with Dad, and we came in the other door, and I forgot all about my bike. And I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to leave it out there. And that child is sincere. I think to bring down a, quote, harsh stroke of discipline in that case would mar that kid's heart.
Right. I don't think that you're accomplishing what you're actually hopefully looking for in your kid's life, which is, we're not just teaching our kids to live within rules, but we're also teaching them how to respect other people. We also have to teach them to be able to follow the New Testament rules about how to treat one another with kindness, with understanding, with love, respect, and all those kinds of things.
Sure.
So as we have discussed in some previous work, that our kids' brains mirror what we do. In fact, at the neuronal level, there's what's called mirror neurons, so that the way that they're treated will become the way that they treat themselves and that they treat other people. And so have parents keep that in mind, that you're sort of mirroring the way that your child's going to respond to their own mistakes.
Yeah.
How do you respond to yourself when you make mistakes? Do you beat yourself up? And do we want our kids beating people up emotionally when they make mistakes?
Yes.
So it's an important distinction.
Childhood irresponsibility versus willful defiance. The willful defiance piece, let's talk there, Gary.
Okay.
Because I think it's also another very important area that we need to understand. I think there are pathways to willful defiance, don't you?
Yeah.
One is just the belligerent child that just says, you know what, I'm not doing it. Versus a child who may, by the way, just have a strong temperament. Let me highlight some of these and let's talk through them. What about temperament issues? Considering the uniqueness of the child, talk to us about temperament, how it plays into defiance.
Well, it's interesting because temperament refers to what your kid comes into the world with. It has to do with like their activity level, their attention span, how well they sort of approach new situations, how well do they handle transitions, how much do they need a pattern, a very predictable pattern in their lives versus being all over the place. Now, when a kid has what we'd call a difficult temperament, they have problems in all those areas. So they're more active than other people, they're more energetic, they've got more problems with attention span, and all those kind of problems come into play. That's not usually going to go that well with a parent's temperament.
Right.
And when you start having sort of this conflict between the two of them, you can get a lot of conflict and a lot of misbehavior out of it.
The lack of match with the parent.
Well, that kind of is where the parent's temperament and the child's temperament are absolutely not mixing well. Right, so you imagine if you're a parent that you like things orderly, you like things predictable, you like things sort of regimented, and you have a child whose temperament is more hyper, more active, and they don't have a very good attention span. They're going to create really what we call bad compatibility. In the same way, for example, in a marriage, husband and wife, when their personalities and their temperaments are very different, the kind of conflict that they get in just because they're so very different in the way that they approach the world.
Gary, you think it would be fair to talk about Ephesians 6:4 here, where it says, "Dads, don't provoke your kids to wrath," that we might even not even recognize it in ourselves, that maybe I don't like my child. You hear what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Maybe I just don't enjoy being around my child. Mm-hmm. And so the fruit of that is that disconnect, or my son or daughter picks up on that, creates a spirit of sort of uneasiness or tension within their heart. And it makes them a little irritable or fiery. You hear what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Well, the not provoking your children to wrath.
Probably more intentionality in there, but I'm
Yeah.
talking about a subtle line here.
Yeah. Well, like you said, we've worked with parents when they come to see us sometimes. They're really frustrated. And they sort of confess to us, I love my child, I'll do anything for him, but I really don't like them. I don't like to be around them. And they're driving me crazy. And in some ways, their child begins to feel the same way. And that's sort of that underlying wrath, that underlying anger, where they start to drift apart. And in some ways, a child begins to almost disidentify with a parent's value system, which can become a real challenge. And when we see that, we want to try to correct it. Some of the things that we talk about in this program will address that.
Okay, so just quick review. Know where we're going. We're talking about willful defiance. We're also talking about the pathways to willful defiance that fuel a child's behavior. We talked about temperament. Some kids just have a different temperament. The second one, a lack of match or fit with a parent. Sometimes parents just don't like their kids, and it creates something. Family stressors fit in here too. Mom and dad going through hard times can create a real sense of uneasiness in a child where they just sort of go off. It's like drinking too much coffee in the morning. You get a little extra coffee and you might move into a spirit of just, I feel irritable, grouchy.
Well, kids are like big sponges, and so family stressors are usually absorbed by kids. And some of the other areas where we've talked about the attachment bond between a parent and child is that kids need to know that you're okay, that they can get to you, that you're accessible, and that you can help them if you need to. A lot of times what happens when families face stresses, whether they're moving, whether dad or mom is changing jobs, whether mom and dad are stressed, even mom and dad being sick or marital problems, all these kind of things can actually cause kids to feel very threatened, like the attachment bond is on the line here.
Right.
Now, the difficult thing is that when kids are feeling threatened, most of them don't go, hey, I'm kind of worried that this is going to happen or that's going to happen. Instead, they get anxious, they get irritable, they get grumpy.
They act it out.
They tend to act out the very stress that they have. So that's one of the things that we want to try to keep in mind, that stressors are absorbed by kids. And every family has a certain number of stressors, but what we want to try to keep in mind is that when your kids' behaviors start to change, all right, sometimes you have to also ask, wait a minute, what's going on in our family stress level? And what are some things that we can actually address?
Now, just think for a moment. You're working through this. Think about your own family for a second. How many pressures or how many things have been coming against your home, literally to tear at the relationship? And we love to think or believe that our kids are immune to this, but they aren't. And it can create within them a spirit. And we don't want to label it with just a spirit of uneasiness or what have you, that precipitates potentially some defiance, or we would interpret it as defiance in their life. Soul wounds, Gary, is the next one. We've written on attachments. We've talked about how brokenness, whether real or perceived by a child in a relationship with a primary caregiver, does a lot to their soul.
Right. Well, that's also the not provoking your child to wrath. Whenever there's a real significant stressor to the parent-child relationship, then we refer to that as a soul wound. It means that a child is really searching and asking, do you really care about me? Do you love me? Can I count on you? If that question is actually chronically on your child's mind, it's very likely that you're going to see one of two patterns of behavior. One is withdrawal, anxiety, clinginess. All right, that's one set of kids, depending on their temperament. The other side is the child who becomes angry and defiant. And then at that point, the normal discipline techniques that you would use will not work, no matter how well you administer them.
Right.
And that's something to keep in mind, because you could be doing really good parenting techniques.
That's a great statement.
But whenever the attachment relationship is wounded, then children really aren't going to respond to those techniques.
Temperament, lack of match with parents, family stressors, soul wounds. By the way, soul wounds could be, Gary, just dad's never around. I know my son Zach, when I'm gone too much, it messes him up. It takes a while for him, literally, to get back in sort of the zone, I call it, when I get back home. And he can come across irritable. He can frustrate me a little bit. You know that?
Oh, yeah.
It's because of my parental absence.
Well, one of the things that is that it's important that you're aware of it. We've had parents, and I've worked with parents who've struggled with this, where a parent's gotten sick and had to go to the hospital. I mean, they're sick. And when they come back home, their kids are very angry and grumpy and irritable. And it's very easy to interpret that as, gee, how disrespectful. I've been sick, and I come home, and look
And
what
you're
you're
acting like a
you're
hellion.
acting like this, right? But it's been something that we've seen for years and years now, is that kids are basically saying, are you going to leave me?
Yeah.
And when they get anxious about that, they also get angry about it. It's not terribly hard to understand in the same like of a marital relationship. If I tell my wife I'm going to be home at 6:30, I show up at 8:30 without any explanation, without any phone call.
Mama's going to get the rod out.
On the one hand, she's going to be anxious about that. She's going to be worried, where is he? She might even call the ER. But she's probably thinking, if he's not at the ER, I'm sending him when he gets home, right? Because it's going to tick her off.
She's going to knock you out.
That's right. And so that's the kind of mix of anxiety and anger go hand in hand when relationships get wounded and there's a threat to just the security of that relationship.
Well, we could spend a day talking about things that precipitate soul wounds in a child's life, but I hope you're following us. I hope we're getting the point across that there are many pathways to defiance for a moment, or that fuel at least a spirit like that parents often respond to negatively, Gary. That's what we're trying to drive home here. Another one is cognitive skill deficits. And Gary, I know this is a real interesting area of study now that we're talking about. Share with us this whole wiring of the brain thing and what's going on in some kids.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we encourage parents to think about is parenting is about teaching your kids to live within limits, but it's also about wiring your children's brain. And God sort of made our brains such that they're not all the way wired when we're born. And so based on the experiences that we have, our brain sort of configures itself. And one of the things that the brain has to learn how to do is to feel out of one part of the brain and to think out of another part of the brain. And the key is to be able to both feel and think at the same time. So that's when we talk about kids being able to deal with frustration, to be able to deal with things not going their way requires that they're both feeling and thinking at the same time. In order to do that, or in order to live kind of within limits, in order to follow rules, in order to deal with the demands that go into day-to-day life. Remember, we've talked about some of the research that shows that kids, on average, get anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 commands a day. Right? Commands are stressful. Now, some kids don't have the cognitive skills in place to really handle demands as well as other kids. And that's a really important. There's a lot of individual differences in how well kids deal with frustration. And some of the cognitive skills that you actually need that some kids have problems with are emotional problem solving. Some kids can solve problems, but when there's emotion that comes to play, they don't do problem solving that well, which is to sort of be able to identify what a problem is, to generate a range of solutions, select what solutions that you want, implement them, make a plan for following them through, monitor the progress. Now that comes very naturally for most people, but for folks with for some of the kids that we deal with who have severe behavioral problems, they usually lack that skill. Cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to think in shades of gray rather than just black, white, either or, all, nothing, I win, you lose. So a lot of these kids who really blow up on us tend to make mountains out of molehills because they think so black and white and so concretely. That also makes them hard to make transitions. So when they're doing one thing and you ask them to do another thing, it's very hard for them to make that cognitive shift into another area. So you'll usually see conflicts come up between tasks, like going from dinner to homework, from homework to bedtime, or from homework to brushing your teeth, taking a bath, and bedtime. It's not just that they don't want to do it, it's also that they have a hard time making those shifts. The other area is in the area of language processing. In order to do problem solving, you have to be able to say what the problem is. A lot of these kids have a hard time sort of describing what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and why they want it. And then finally, emotion regulation. If you know, some kids just get grumpy, they just get irritable, and it seems to come out of nowhere. It's not really tied to anything in particular. And what's important to keep in mind is that once they're in that state, just the smallest little demand or command can sort of send them off. So what we have found in the research is that there's a number of kids who have defiance that's more than just defiance. They also have problems with all these cognitive skills.
Yes.
And their moods tend to be fairly up and down very, very rapidly. And it's very easy for parents to think that the reason their child's acting up is because of a motivational deficit. The reason he's doing that is because he just wants to get his way. Well, all kids want to get their way. But what really turns into is that they also lack the skills to be able to make those kind of transitions.
Well, I'll just
and
beat
deal
it
with-
out of
That's
it, not
right.
my kid. You know what I'm saying?
And it's important because if you think that it's a motivational problem, then you're going to use motivational means to get it out, which is usually a lot of behavioral techniques where we either use a lot of punishment or we use a lot of incentives. And those things work temporarily, but they don't work in the long run because we have to be able to address those cognitive skills.
Gary, I have two more down here. One is I'd like to talk about learned behavior. I think sometimes, there's that scripture that says, be careful being in a relationship with an angry man, for if you do, you'll learn his ways and be ensnared by them. That living in the cage of anger or defiance, if you see nothing but that modeled around you, and that level of disrespect communicated to, say, mom from dad, or from mom to dad, you know what I'm saying? Then children pick up on that, and they start thinking that's how you do relationships.
Sure.
And we're going to beat it out of our kids even though we do it. And then the final one, Gary, is there is this rebellious spirit piece that some kids seem to have. Well, we're all prone to do wrong. The things we wouldn't do, we do, and the things we would do, we don't. Therefore, we have to daily reckon and yield our life to the Lord. And some kids know that they have just willfully made a choice that was wrong. And so we don't want to deny any of that. We're putting it all in place, but
Right.
we're trying to talk about the element of childhood irresponsibility and the issue of willful defiance. And so I think what we're trying to do is break apart the word defiance and separate out willful versus defiance that's led by a number of pathways toward it. That's important because a lot of parents don't take the time to work through those issues. And what they wind up doing is marring the soul of a child. And ultimately, Gary, I think it feeds back into where what they do is they create soul wounds in that child where these kids literally grow up and they hate their parents for how their parents treated them. Do you remember? He did that to me, and he had no reason for doing it. Dad may have felt totally justified, okay, in grounding him for 5 years or something. But the child, it didn't fit.
Yeah.
You see, it's
It
that
didn't
kind of
register.
disconnect that troubles us in a lot of what's done in the area of discipline. All right, that leads us now into our outline to then, what are the typical patterns of response when kids act up, when they get out of line? And the very first one is the issue of, and if you're following your notes there, coercion. We just move to correct. Now,
Right.
what I'd like to do is stop there just for a moment, Gary, and talk about the difference then between discipline and punishment. People often use these two terms interchangeably. I don't like that.
Right.
I know some people don't mean bad by the word punishment, but let's talk about discipline as correction for an act versus punishment as the person's bad. You hear what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, I mean, another way that we look at is discipline is goal-oriented. I'm trying to accomplish something in my child. I'm trying to teach him something. And discipline is the method or methods that I'll use to get there. And there's a flexibility to that because you're really looking at what works for this kid to help him get there. It's like a baseball coach trying to teach a kid how to catch ground balls. There's some kids that you can simply say, bend over and pick it up. There's other kids who need more practice in an area and more specific instruction. Punishment, generally, and parents who use a lot of punishment, when we really boil it down and they're being really honest, are simply getting even.
Yes.
right? It's the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So you did this, so you're going to get that. And that's the idea of administering justice, sort of, or administering revenge. You, in a sense, it's not necessarily designed to teach, except perhaps that a child may say, "Ooh, man, that hurt, so I'm not going to do it again." But we hope that our children do it not just because they're trying to avoid pain or get out of a punishment, but because they understand, and Jesus talks about this, throughout the New Testament, is that the law isn't that you're just avoiding punishment. The law is that you love God and that you love your neighbor as you love yourself. That is the essence of the law. If the law is simply just to avoid punishment, you're missing it. So purely punishment-based parenting is designed to say, you better not do it or you're going to get X. There's a place for that, but that's sort of missing the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish with kids. And I think discipline is a more flexible way of saying we want to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And I think punishment also mars the soul of a child. There's no place for abusing a child in any way. And Gary, I think of some of the things in the days when we grew up that were permissible that we often saw maybe lived out in other kids' lives, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, the slap to the head, punching a kid, kicking a kid.
Right.
Digging your claws into a child, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Or literally getting in their face and just abusing them verbally.
Right.
Assaulting them with words. There's no place for that. That has not discipline. That's punishment. That's marring the soul of a child.
Yeah, and it really is revenge. It means that you're ticked off and you're sort of taking that out on your kid, and then there's folks who try to come back and say, well, I was just doing the scriptural mandate to discipline my child, and we don't believe in that. We don't think that the Scripture supports it, and we generally call parents on it. And I personally have never had a parent object to it once we got down to brass tacks.
Now, under this coercion piece, there's also this idea that there's a progression, Gary, that we usually go through in correction.
Right.
Usually up front, we talk to our kids.
Right.
I'm going to straighten you out right now. Get over here, Johnny. Let's do this. And so I am, do you understand me?
Right.
Talking, if it doesn't work, leads to yelling,
Right.
which typically leads to threats. If you don't do X, I'm going to do Y, which, by the way, leads to, all right, you're grounded.
Right.
Time out.
Right.
What have you. Ultimately then to, let's call it corporal punishment or spanking of some sort.
Right. Yeah, it's the one-up kind of thing. If you don't do this, then I'm going to do that. Oh, if you don't do this, then I'm going to do that. Now, how many times have I told you? Because if you do that one more time, then I'm going to let you.
I'm going to count.
And before long, if, for example, if you ask your child, I need you to clean your room.
Yeah.
All right. I told you I need you to clean your room. How many times have I told you you need to clean your room? Did you clean your room yet? By the time you get to the end of this, if you don't clean your room, then you're going to lose your PlayStation until you're 21. At this point in time, your child has avoided cleaning his room for the last hour and a half or 2 hours.
Yeah.
Right? That's incredibly reinforcing to him. Because why? Well, because he's avoiding doing something that he doesn't want to do. And in some ways, it's reinforcing to you as a parent because you're avoiding a big conflict which you don't want to get into.
Yeah.
So we talk to parents about the way they get out of coercion is mean what you say and say what you mean. If you want them to clean their room, then be prepared to really follow through with that command when you give it.
Now, Gary, what's hard, though, for a lot of parents is typically they default then to what works. And so the next time child gets out of line, even if it's a small infraction, they immediately escalate to, okay, if you don't do Y, I'm telling you, I'm taking this as a double defiance.
Right.
We're going to knock your lights out here to solve this thing. And so what goes on then at home, or even minor infractions, especially if I'm stressed out, is we go straight to the elevator.
Right. Right. And your kid does too, because the next time he's going to meet you where you left off. So that's the problem with coercion. Then the other time, parents go to the other extreme.
Sure.
Where they go to just permissiveness. They feel
Total
like,
permissiveness.
what's the use in trying to get my kid to do anything? He's not going to do it, so a parent gives up. Or a parent's too busy to really follow through with, setting down rules, but then following through with the consequences and outcomes that they need to have in place.
Yes. And Gary, with the over-permissiveness, really I think it shows that people who are very authoritarian, very strict, produce basically the same kind of kids that over-permissive parents
That's
do.
right. That's right.
These are kids, by the way, who don't really understand responsibility. They have trouble making their own decisions. They get often confused by life that's all over the map.
That's right.
Now, we challenge parents under these typical patterns of response to move to a corrective relational experience. And in that, Gary, we're not arguing against having some type of boundary and consequence at all.
Right.
If anything, it's about a change of heart along with the change of behavior. Explain that a little bit.
Well, this is especially important when you and your child have really gotten locked into some battles, and you're a frustrated parent, and your kid's a frustrated child, and they're angry and defiant at one level. In order to get discipline strategies to work, at that point in time, there's going to need to be a change in the relationship. In other words, until your child actually feels like the relationship is back on track, right? And until there's a change of heart, even in the parent toward the child, it's very likely that no matter what discipline strategy you use, it's going to backfire.
So the quality of your relationship largely impacts the effectiveness of your discipline strategy. That's why some kids, by the way, respond to a good talking to.
Right.
When you explain, no, wait a second.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right. This is not acceptable in our home. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad.
Right.
And they get it. Or they have a little timeout. And all of a sudden it dawns on them.
Right. Well, and then there's times, and I've even done this with my own children, where I feel like I've handled things poorly, either by being too grumpy, irritable, crabby, and for a parent to even go back to their kid and say, listen, I don't like the way I handled that. I don't like the way I handled myself, and I don't like how angry I was. So, I want to apologize for that. Now, we got to deal with what my concerns are now regarding your stuff, all right?
Yes.
But that can be very powerful. But then we also have a set of strategies that we use that we won't unpack here, but about sometimes kids won't hear your words. Sometimes you need the behavioral, the time that you actually start to put into the relationship, those one-to-one times that we describe as special time or time banking. In some of the other work that we've done that is more designed specifically to help parents improve their relationship with their kid by taking and building in to their day-to-day structure some one-to-one time with their child that's not around doing chores or not about giving commands, not about asking intrusive questions, but simply, basically for younger kids especially, being on the floor with them and following them in some activities.
So when the relationship piece is missing, that's why you can go all the way to a point where spanking literally becomes counterproductive.
Right.
If the relationship isn't working and I'm doing that, it seems like then all I'm doing is spanking, and I'm not really creating a compliant child.
No,
you can't. I've got a terrified child is what I have.
Right.
And they're not making any life lessons, so it's not really about discipline anymore. It literally is about punishing a kid.
Right, and depending on your child, it's going to backfire in different ways. But a lot of the defiant kids just keep getting angrier and angrier, and they step it up. It's no longer just defiance at home. Then it starts to spill over into school, and then into grades, and then sort of identifying with other kids who feel pretty angry and ticked off, which begins down that whole pathway of potentially messing around with drugs and getting in trouble in some more serious ways. As
we move towards closure here, we want to talk about the 7 steps to effective discipline with kids and put these all in context. Some of it's restating what we've taught already, but we want you to progressively work your way through this. Number 1, Gary was talking about an environment or creating an environment for moral growth. And I think that really starts back with the parent understanding that they have a role here of influence. And the responsible thing is to know what our goal is in correcting or disciplining our children. Disciplining is about culturing growing a child.
Right.
Getting them to a place where they feel like they're becoming responsible and they're able to make decisions.
Right.
And they're growing up.
Well, one of the ways that we advocate for that is when we talk to parents about respect, in terms of the respect that you show toward your child. And we talk about 2 kinds of respect. the one is what we call eye for an eye respect. That means you say to your child, I'm only going to be as respectful to you as you are to me. And we challenge parents if they hold that belief, because I don't think it's New Testament oriented. That what we're going to say to our kids is, I'm going to respect you and treat you respectfully no matter how you treat me. That doesn't mean I lose my hierarchy, by the way. I'm still in control. I can be very respectful to you as a child, but maintain my authority.
Yes.
And so we encourage and we teach parents how to do that. But as a parent, you have a responsibility to treat your child with respect and dignity, regardless of how they're behaving. And we encourage parents to never use disrespect as a form of punishment. Right? Disrespect, putting a kid down, and tearing him down is not a form of punishment.
No.
And it's not a form of discipline. It doesn't work, and it creates some pretty serious soul wounds in kids. So you can be effective incredibly as a parent by remaining respectful, and then also establishing rules, following through with rules, and following through with consequences.
Creating an environment for moral growth. Number 2, making our rules and limits clear.
Right.
Understanding exactly what's expected of kids. I think oftentimes we discipline our kids for things they don't really understand. It's hard for me to believe that, Gary, but I tell you, I've learned it so much in coaching baseball with kids and coaching basketball. A lot of kids, they sit there and they'll nod. I got to coach, and they don't have the foggiest idea what you just told them. You know what I'm saying? And so when we don't make them clear, it gets confusing to kids, and then they start thinking, you know what, he's just angry, he's just mean, you're just mean, you're being mean tonight, Mom.
Right.
You're being mean tonight, Dad. And just as important to that, Gary, is the idea that we want to have rules that we're willing to enforce.
That's right. So one of the things that happens is the more frustrated you get as a parent, you'll probably find the more rules that you want to create, which that can backfire.
Yes.
Usually, it's sort of surprising to parents when they come to talk to us about this, is that we try to get them down to the rule of 5. Usually, you want to try to find, if you're having troubles and you find that you've got way too many rules, one of the first things we do is trim down the rules.
But because, Gary, typically when the relationship has gone south with your child, you typically increase the number of rules.
Right.
And you wind up disciplining all the more.
Right.
That's why it's out of control.
Yeah, I mean, everything becomes an opportunity to have a battle about a rule. And so there's certain rules that you have to be able to trim back. And a lot of families run very fine ships by having about 5 or 6 major rules that are in place.
And those are the things that are the non-negotiables.
That's right.
That we're going to do around here.
Right.
To help give us guidance.
And it's also good to have a number of rules that are negotiable, and to give your child a chance to make a case for why he should or should not be able to do something, and that can be actually very effective for him.
Number 3, teach your child the reasoning behind your rules. Gary,
Right.
Some people say, I don't have to, these are just the rules here, period. Why is it important to teach your child the reasoning? It relates back to what this is all about, right?
Right. And
why we're disciplined.
Right. And hopefully the reason that the rules that you live by them because you think there's good reasons to do them. You're not just doing
They're
it because
important because they create a quality of life that we're looking for.
And the thing that we talked about earlier, the way that we control our emotional brain is with our rational brain. So that means that things have to make sense for us to do them.
Right.
So our kids have to really understand the reasons. They don't have to like the reasons, by the way. They don't have to agree with them, but they have to understand that there are reasons. By the way, most of the rules that we have at homes do make sense to kids if they're reasonable. Right? You have to ask yourself about your own rules sometimes. Sometimes parents don't even like to reflect on their rules because they sort of see, well, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that I'm doing this.
Number 4, discern between intentional or willful defiance and childish irresponsibility. We've talked a lot about that. Just punctuate it one more time, Gary. The idea is there's many pathways to stuff that creates frustration in parents.
Right.
Kids being irresponsible versus the pathways to defiance and ultimately to rebellion or willful defiance.
Right.
And by the way, we would say that spanking probably should only be reserved for willful defiance.
Right, and even in certain cases of that, because sometimes willful defiance, interestingly, if you check it out, your kid has a reason for doing it. It doesn't mean it's a good reason, doesn't mean it's a valid reason, but helping him or her explain that reason can be a very powerful way for you and that child to have a conversation around it.
So that you in turn make sure you're not disciplining your child when they have something in their heart that makes sense to them, and then it creates a spirit of rebellion or rebuke inside them, and the spanking did no good.
Right.
You may have hurt them for a second, but what you did in their spirit was you created fire in them.
That's right, that's right. And so it's important to get the reason out. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, and it doesn't mean that the consequences don't still apply. But kids have to be able to do that. Remember, you want your kid to be interested in what you have to say, also means you've got to be interested in what they have to say. So that's the reason.
And what's interesting too is we're often as parents we don't do the emotion stuff very well. We don't like our kids to be angry.
Mm-mm.
We don't allow them so we don't emotion coach our kids.
Right.
And we need to get beyond that and realize, even in our own spiritual lives with God is big enough to handle our emotion toward Him.
Right.
Now, we shouldn't stay there, and that's what we want to try to teach kids to handle.
Right.
All right. Gary, the next one is avoid making impossible demands.
A lot of times that is really about recognizing every kid's different in what some kids can do, other kids can't do. I'll give you, for example, when my son wakes up in the morning, he's not a terribly happy soul. And if I know that he's a type of kid that if I use what I call a chore ambush on him, as soon as he gets out of bed in the morning, I'm going to see the worst of his behavior. So I had a trash can that I wanted emptied. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's cold outside, it's raining. And, part of me wanted to say, take this trash out now. All right. Now, I could have done that. But the problem with that would have been, I would have really created some conflict there that I don't think really needed to happen at that point in time.
Sure.
There's another point in the day and time in the day when that can happen. And I did. And I actually had to refrain, right, because I wanted it done right there. It was just, it was just bugging me. And I waited, and probably 5 minutes before the bus came, I asked him to take it out, and it was a much easier process than what I think it would have been otherwise. That's sort of knowing what your kids can do and can't do. There's other kids who you could say take the trash out, and they would take it out, and that wouldn't be a problem. So you're making some adjustments for what your kids, where they are in their ability to deal with frustration.
But I'm just sitting there thinking, Gary, so many parents that I've worked with, and I know even in my own life, I don't sit down and take the time to do these things. I guess it's because we're so busy, so preoccupied, and we're running at a pace that doesn't allow for healthy parenting.
Yeah.
No wonder our kids struggle so much. And by the way, we're all nothing but big kids, and we all have our own stories. Let love be what guides and drives you. If your heart isn't toward your child, you're missing something. Children are vulnerable, and every child deserves at least one kid, like we said earlier, who's crazy about him or her. As we move to our final piece here, Gary, I want to talk about correction that is appropriate to the offense, and 4 primary levels of enforcement and just dialogue around them. Making sure that you're, again, appropriate for the violation that's occurred.
Right.
We talk about, number 1, words being powerful. There are times when that's all that needs to be done is just sit them down, talk to them, and say, Johnny, you're not going to do this again. Okay, that's a correction piece. Level 2, some people talk about the use of timeout, Gary, and I want you to address that just real quick. When is timeout appropriate? I know there's some debate now about the value of timeout.
Right. There are some kids who respond well to timeout. You'll know if your kid does or doesn't, especially if they serve the timeout and they seem to benefit from it. And it's usually used best for when a kid is defying what you're asking him to do. So if I would say to my son, take that trash out, and he doesn't take the trash out, I can say, listen, you're going to spend 5 minutes in timeout, all right? And when you're ready to take the trash out, then you can come out of it. So you got to serve a minimum of 5, then you'll take the trash out. If you don't take the trash out, you'll stay there until you're ready to do it. I mean, that's an example of using timeout, and that might be for defiance. Aggression is a good place to use timeout for. So when kids do aggress or they're, yelling at their brothers and sisters or being at all physically aggressive, usually timeout's a good time for that. There's other places where we use timeout, but we in our work have found that we try some of the other things first, and then we find that timeout. Then we'll add timeout if we need to later.
Level 3, removal of privileges, and just taking away anything. But usually in the context of a relationship, you learn what's valuable or important to your child. And it's out of the context of a relationship, by the way, that'll largely determine the effectiveness of this.
Well, and there's two ways of taking things away, and let's talk about the difference real quickly. There's two kind of statements you can make to your kids. You can do the if-then, right? That looks like this. If you don't do this, then you're going to lose that. If you don't take this trash out, then you lose TV for the night. Mm-hmm. All right, so he doesn't take the trash out. Now I say, you lose the TV for the whole night. The problem with that approach is that now I get all the attitude that comes with the lost TV for the rest of the night.
Right.
The other way of using it is what we call it the Premack principle, which is you need to take the trash out, all right? And you're not doing anything, including TV, until it's done. So that's what we call when-then. So when you get this done, then you can have this back. So in this way, it's in the child's hands. The ball's in his court completely, okay? And you lose the power play, right? And we find that to be a more effective way of using the removal of privileges. To simply ground a kid, then a lot of times as parents will say, I mean, how many parents have grounded a child and then they feel like, oh man, this is driving me crazy, because the child now is in the advantage of sort of making life miserable with their attitude and with various other kinds of things they can do to irritate you. In this case, the ball's in his court or her court until they do what it is that you're asking them to do. And it tends to be a much more effective way of administering
And the final
it.
piece is the swats or spanking issue. And in most cases, Gary, where that comes in, again, double defiance is usually what people talk about for the use of spanking. I remember reading some of the early pioneers, and I know in Dare to Discipline, Dr. Dobson talks about spanking should be reserved for kids about ages 1.5 to 6. Used sparingly from 6 to 9, certainly not spanking after the age of 9. It just tends to be counterproductive.
Right.
For some children, Gary, and we look at all these 4 levels, discipline in any of those 4 areas could be severe.
Right.
We tend to think that spanking is the ultimate way to straighten it out. It might be that your child's temperament or personality or their way of relating, a good talking to, absolutely, it's horrifying to them.
Right.
It could be that time away from you is mortifying to a child, and timeout's horrible for them. Mm-hmm. It could be a SWAT. With, let's call it Fred Rupp, whatever you use as a paddle or what have you. Some kids, by the way, man, it would destroy them. Mm-hmm. They're not there for that. And the idea is making sure that we discipline.
And what works for your kid for the most part, and now one set of kids that don't really respond well to spanking are the kids who are a little bit more callous and a little bit more unemotional. Mm-hmm. So that when you spank those kids, they actually get angrier and more defiant. And so what happens, though, is parents think, well, they need more of it, and they need it harder. And we want to warn parents, and for folks who are working with parents, that there are kids who have that as a temperament that do not respond well to spanking. And you have to find some other ways of addressing discipline with them, or it can really lead to some more problems than what you're looking for.
The quality of your relationship determines the effectiveness of your discipline strategies. We'd like to remind anyone who has influence in a child's life that relationship is really important. And by the way, catching kids and doing things that are good and healthy and positively reinforcing those things are as significant as negatively reinforcing things that we often think about when we think about disciplining our kids. Somehow, in the midst of all of this, if our heart is built out of a context of love for our kids, believing that every child is so impressionable, so vulnerable, that they need heavy doses of us, if we can come out of that context and we really give our all and our investedness to a child's life, then, and probably only then, are we doing the good work that God's called us to in parenting or in any way having influence in a child's life. It's out of that we want to challenge you to grow and to find new life in what you're doing with kids. God protect our kids. They need us to be deeply invested in them in every way. God bless you. Thanks for being a part of this particular course.